Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko in Ohio.
And today we're going to be talking about something that's in the news quite a lot. We're going to be talking with Jasper Craven, who is an American investigative journalist and author who covers military, veterans affairs, modern masculinity. We're going to be talking about his book, God Forgives, Brothers Don't, The Long March of Military Education and the Making of American Manhood. Jasper, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thanks for having me, gents.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure. This issue's been always around, if you're familiar with the literature, but in the last decade or so, with the emergence of Trump especially, it's become very big, very enormous. And now we have, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, later, Hegseth and testosterone and working out in gyms and all that. You chose to look at military education as kind of the fulcrum for this. Why did you do that? Let's start with that. Like, why look at these, like the way West Point, ROTC programs, Boy Scouts, all this other stuff?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because military education is a foreign concept. It's not many people would know how to define it, I think. But as I was looking to write a book about how the military influences young men, it felt like the places where that work was most explicit, where there was like an actual curriculum, a pedagogy, was via this military education network that I defined to include the 5,200 JROTC and ROTC units and public high schools and colleges, service academies like West Point, Boy Scouts, Young Marines, other sort of youth military adjacent programs, and then a sort of constellation of state religiously chartered or private military schools like VMI and the Citadel and Valley Forge just outside of Philadelphia. As I note in the introduction, everyone who enters the military endures some abridged version of military education via boot camp. Really, I'm focusing on the big ideas that animate the system, the deceptive sort of ideologies, and then the brutal tactics to create obedience and animate violence and all of the rest. So it just felt like the story was probably told best through these places. Plus, in the case of West Point in particular, you have an institution that has existed essentially since the Revolutionary War. And so it offers a single place to track this evolution over time. So that's why I landed on the framing that I did.
And just let me follow up on that. You, at the very beginning, you say masculinity is essentially manufactured. I don't remember the specific words you used, but it's essentially manufactured. It's not innate. It's not born. And these schools, obviously, do you want to just elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that from my own experience, and I think anyone can probably tap into this sense, children are incredibly malleable and also have wonderful imaginations about what the world can be in ways that feel very pure and often utopian. And as I came to look at American masculinity today, I felt that many of the sort of core concepts around masculinity in general that America upholds really have little to do with the sort of like innate instincts of a young man, but instead are these sort of concepts that are explicitly aimed at forming battlefield instincts and loyalties that the military relies on. If you think about like the idea of sacrifice is such a sort of cornerstone virtue for men. And again, like the, there, I don't think that's necessarily like an innate part of who man is. There are certain like elements of that I think can be deployed in healthy ways, but really at the end of the day, I argue, and I marshal historical evidence to show that this is basically an effort, really just like a recruiting effort that has pervaded this country since its existence to prime young male minds to think that, their own their own death on the battlefield is glorious and a virtue in and of itself. And so I just think that other ideas around strength and core American masculinity really are divorced from man's sort of natural growth and inherent sort of desire. I also argue, and I've spoken to a number of experts in veterans' mental health, that PTSD is pretty good evidence that violence is not inherent to man. Otherwise, it would not create such intense psychic damage. So, yeah, I believe it's strictly a construction. Certainly, it's true that throughout world history, soldier has been man's defining vocation. This is something that has been hardwired into American men. And I think because of that, just through generation after generation, it has impacted man on a genomic level. And there are practical reasons for that historically to secure safety and resources and access to the sea and all of these things. But the truth of the matter is that we live in a world now that is enlightened and developed to the point where those those sort of behaviors are no longer really required. And so at this moment, many men are grappling with these old school, outmoded ideas of how to serve a society and validate their masculinity, but very few opportunities to actually do so in a way that feels just or honorable or supportive of their country in a real way. And so this energy is just basically warping, mutating, and now exploding out in all of these strange, weird, violent ways, whether it's through the manosphere or the ranks of ICE or many municipal police departments or the military as well, obviously.
But one quick follow-up question I have is there's also other vehicles for this embedding masculinity in our culture. I think about sports, I think about business. It seems like with the military, that it's a much more intentional system of indoctrination that was created 250 years ago or what have you. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are
Yeah.
in comparison to these other institutions and systems.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel every time someone writes a book and gets interviewed, they always try to bring sort of question outside of the realm back to their topic. But I think in the case of the military, you can
Mhm.
see how military influences sports and business.
Mm.
Like from the very beginning of West Point, which just to clarify for listeners is America's first and most elite service academy that trains the officer class. Many legendary generals, defense secretaries have attended West Point, and West Point offered from the start a sort of delayed access to financial power, capitalistic power. It was
Mhm.
the sort of deal from the beginning was you spend some time in the military and you're able to gain prestige, reputation, masculinity, all of these things. And then yes, you are not paid lucratively, but once you exit, you can quickly enter into the burgeoning military industrial complex. And so you see Henry DuPont, for instance, an early West Point graduate, parlay his access into the military to sell gunpowder and weapons to the War Department. Early West Pointers created very powerful foundries in upstate New York that also built weapons. That same trend has been supercharged today with graduates, retired brass going to Lockheed Martin, and also running Fortune 500 companies. There's actually a business consultancy that's located right next to West Point in upstate New York called the Thayer Institute, named after West Point's godfather, which pledges to take West Point graduates, embed them in Fortune 500 environments, and inculcate these sort of these militaristic ideas around obedience and hierarchy and all of the rest to improve business. This is all a fallacy, by the way. There's a really interesting peer-reviewed report that analyzed companies on the stock market with military brass on the board, and they did not perform any better than those without military brass. But I think a lot of these ideas, they originate in military context through graduates and the sort of general sense that military veterans are like exemplary leaders and have unquestionable integrity and drive and all of these things. So I think and same thing with sports. West Point really pioneered American football culture in some respects, and very early on was critical in equating these two, football and military action are similar in many ways. And so I think with that sport in particular, you can see real influence. But yeah, the fact of the matter is just that the military has been so dominant for so long. If you just look over the last 250 years of American history, there are very few periods where America is not at war. And so I just think that the pedagogy, yes, developed, pioneered in the military, and then it just leaks out into the cultural groundwater. It leaks out into the business environments. It leaks out into sports.
I've never been in the military, but I played sports, and it's identical to what you described there, the kind of what, the coaching in there. So there's a real correlation there. Because I think most of the time we're going to spend today talking about more contemporary stuff, and especially Hegseth and what we're seeing today. But do you want to, you give a really nice historical background here. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? The creation of West Point, you just mentioned that. Boy Scouts, McFadden and masculinity. Just briefly kind of talk about kind of how this evolved.
Yeah, ultimately what I aimed to do, really just to sell the book, was to point to a number of prevailing masculine trends today and then find historical roots to those trends. And I wasn't totally sure with the proposal that I could make that happen super seamlessly. But as it turned out, thankfully, that there are a lot of really interesting characters, figures, organizations that I think help explain the sort of current extremity of all of these different sort of forms of masculine dysfunction we're seeing today. One of those figures is Bernard McFadden, who was a magazine magnate on par with William Randolph Hearst in the early 20th century, also owned a number of military schools, and really was a pioneer in gym culture, physical fitness, also very much like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., had many sort of harebrained nutritional and scientific theories, vehemently anti-vaccine, hated white bread and other processed foods, ate basically a raw diet of fruits and vegetables. At the same time, his work using cold therapies for muscle rejuvenation were developed or were adopted by the War Department after World War II to help veterans heal. So he's an interesting guy, also wildly charismatic, a sexual freak, just a bizarre person who I think helps explain the sort of current male obsession with fitness. And really, what in his story is a man who, like much of the country and especially the War Department, became intensely anxious as strongmen in Europe, like Hitler and Mussolini, really prioritized their countries around physical strength that equated the strength of a population to its future and its power and all of these things. People at the War Department became very anxious, for instance, that Hitler was injecting the SS with anabolic steroids. And so they reacted in turn, partly due to Bernard's agitations, by completely revamping their nutritional standards, by drafting new physical fitness regimes, really like focusing on specific muscle groups, teaching cadets, privates, new enlistees hand-to-hand combat for the first time. And so McFadden was a soft eugenicist really looked up to the strongmen of Europe and, among other things, helps, I think, illustrate the fact that America adopted a lot of the sort of beauty standards and shallow physical obsession that authoritarian figures in Europe did during and after World War II. You
Just to
know,
bring in a pop culture reference, that actually makes me think of Captain America and the super soldier, which
Made me think of Jack the Ripper from Strangelove,
yeah,
actually.
yeah.
both great references. And yeah, and that's the other thing with so many of these things is you see them reflected in popular culture. And I talk a lot about the Boy Scouts as well, which sort of the Boy Scouts of America started off mostly focused on outdoor adventure and the natural world. There were two flanks, that one, and then a sort of more militaristic wing that, thanks to lobbying from Teddy Roosevelt and others, won out. And so the Boy Scouts became an explicitly focused militaristic organization, created a pipeline into the military for Boy Scouts, had scouts, doing sort of various domestic missions, selling war bonds, etc., collecting scrap metal, etc. during the war. And there was another sort of interesting cultural development from this moment is as the Boy Scouts were really gaining power in the United States, there was a concurrent effort by socialists, chaplains, suffragettes, radical educators to push back against the infiltration of militaristic ideas in the classroom and compulsory military education. And many of these were women, female teachers in New York City and elsewhere, and they won a number of battles, not all of them, of course. But as part of this, there was this explicit focus to demonize female teachers and fearmonger about the influence that females in general could have on young boys and how that would disabuse them of their aggression and all of the rest. And concurrent to this, on the part of the Boy Scouts, industrialists, politicians, was to shift away from the sort of main visage of America at the time, Lady Liberty, into a more masculine coded figure, Uncle Sam. So you see in that point too, like with the Boy Scouts and other groups, a real effort to curb the influence of like feminine ideas over young boys.
I wasn't a military historian per se, but I operated in that field. And so I knew a lot of people who taught at various academies, West Point, Annapolis, so forth, and even at lower levels. And my perception was that the students there got kind of an elite education. They were reading, like, they loved history. The military really does a great job in teaching history, right? But they had like a diverse faculty. They were learning English, literature, a traditional liberal education, what we would call liberal education today, right? And at the same time, they're getting the lessons that you're talking about here in masculinity. Was there ever a tension between those, this kind of elite? Because one of the first things Hegseth and Trump do is ban all these books and get rid of these libraries and so forth. Was there ever a tension between that?
Yeah, I think that these military schools have always been science and engineering focused
Yeah.
first and foremost. The godfather, Sylvanus Thayer of West Point, was a brilliant engineer. And the school rather, turned out a number of incredible engineers in the early days who focused on public works in America, and which is fantastic. It really was vital to building up American infrastructure. I frankly wish that the US military could do more of these sorts of projects instead of just oriented around missions of destruction. But much of New York was built by West Point graduates, including the Brooklyn Bridge, railroads, bridges, water treatment plants, et cetera, all across the country were designed by West Point graduates. But you're right, there has long been a tension between the sort of STEM hard subject matter experts at these places and the humanities professors. Generally, the humanities have been taught, at least in the last 80 or so years, by civilians, though not always. There are some really brilliant professors of English and history who emerged from military environments that I spoke to for the book. But I think things really became tense during Vietnam because these schools in particular adopted a sort of bunker mentality. These people were so used to universal acclaim and reflexive adoration coming out of the World War II era. For example, a West Point cadet could travel south down the Hudson and go to New York City for a weekend, and he would be guaranteed to much flirtation from young girls, free meals, free drinks, often even free hotel rooms. Cadets love donning their uniforms and spending weekends in New York City. But with Vietnam, everything changed. They lost all of those perks. The girls at Vassar and other schools who had once lined up to date them started protesting outside of the gates. And so this deep cynicism set in. And alongside that, a real aversion to outside information or information that challenged their own underlying notions and their sense of the military as infallible. There's a great anecdote in the story where I think it's a professor at the United States Air Force Academy, an English professor, tells of a cadet complaining that he had to read Moby Dick because this was a book about failure, and how dare this professor even raise the possibility of failure with this young cadet who's about to be sent off to fly over Vietnam. Unfortunately, I think the sort of like nuances of the humanities is repeatedly suppressed, not by like department heads, certainly not by cadets. Most cadets I spoke to really loved their humanities courses, felt they were really crucial to their understandings of the world, including many of the POWs who came back from Vietnam actually said explicitly, all of the mock POW camps that we did not in any way prepare us for these experiences. What it was, the humanities, poetry, Shakespeare that we could recall and think about to maintain sanity. So there's been acknowledgement over the decades of how important these sorts of courses are, but I think that the leadership, whenever it feels threatened or in some sort of backwards attempt to create blind loyalty, it often cracks down on these subjects. And that's exactly what we're seeing today.
The other factor in a lot of the toxic masculine culture and military culture is Christianity. I think in your book or one of your articles I read, 70% of people within the military identify as Christian. And I'm wondering how Christianity plays into this sort of entrenching of this culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially now that we're in this age of Christian nationalists, like maybe our Secretary of Defense is a Christian nationalist, right?
Yeah, totally. No, it's a good question. And one I hadn't really, one I had neglected for much of the book writing until I got to Vietnam. The truth of the matter is that there's always been a sort of religious subculture in the US military, and certain military leaders have long understood the sort of potential power of religion to buttress and fortify for fighting. Obviously, the promise of salvation and heaven is helpful for selling a young cadet about to be sent to the beaches of Normandy. But that being said, up until Vietnam, really, the military chaplaincy was dominated by mainline Protestants, and they saw their work explicitly as providing pastoral care, helping troops on the battlefield deal with the traumas they were experiencing. They helped with funerals. They were there in a therapeutic sense, strictly. However, during Vietnam, many of these chaplains were disgusted by the war and left the military entirely. And so all of a sudden, there is a huge vacancy problem in the chaplaincy. At the same time, the draft has ended, and the Reagan administration appoints an evangelical from the South to concoct new plans for manpower and recruitment. And so really at the same time, evangelicals funnel very explicitly and in concert into the chaplaincy, and the Reagan administration deploy a new recruitment strategy focused on poor, rural, religious communities. Obviously, the deep beliefs in proselytizing that these new religious sects held deep align very well with military rhetoric. And so it was a natural marriage. And at the same time, the US Air Force Academy, which had been formed just after World War II, is coming into its own. It was formed in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is a mecca of megachurches and evangelical groups. And so you see just symbiotic bonds form there. And the Air Force became extremely powerful in the second half of the 20th century into today. And so a lot of religious zealots, Christian nationalists begin to rise from the Air Force into positions of power. Curtis LeMay being one of them, the inspiration for Ripper in Doctor Strangelove. So, not to belabor the point, but then 9/11 happens, and Bush, in the days after, slips up and calls it a crusade, and many other figures in the military do as well. They speak in explicitly religious terms. A young Pete Hegseth is in the National Guard at this time, becomes deeply animated around the war on terror, and comes to develop a virulent Islamophobia, evident, according to the New York Times, at a bar in Ohio in the 2010s, where he screams, "Kill all Muslims," while trashed. And then just the final step is the current war in Iran and our enduring alliance with Israel. Once Hegseth realized that his fight against Islam via Iraq and Afghanistan was terminally cursed and could not be salvaged, at least in the eyes of the American public, he turns to Israel. This is while he's a Fox News host. Hegseth repeatedly visits Israel as a Fox News host, does specials from Israel, and really sees in this place a new front in the battle against Islam. And I think that partially helped explain our involvement in Iran and our sort of unyielding deference to Israeli foreign policy today.
In the, let's say before World War II, or even including World War II, you often, when you read about wars and especially actual battles, you see some concept of chivalry involved in there. So even though they're in this very masculine atmosphere, cultural atmosphere, there's also this sense of playing fair and accepting your enemy's sword and not committing crimes against civilians at all, even though that obviously always happened, right? When does that switch flip? And now you don't really have anything like that. Now Hegseth is bragging about killing everybody he can. That kind of whole idea of being chivalrous. And even though you're in this brutal, deadly, bloody kind of culture, there's always this, I don't know if it's redemptive or not, but there's always this sense that there's a rule or something involved there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's another really important shift in military ideology and mentality and masculine virtue. There was plenty of brutality and unwarranted violence in the first part of American history, but especially in the 20th century in modern warfare, there was a certain culture of noblesse oblige and chivalry and belief in American ideals. One thing that America and the US military share are these very noble but poorly defined ideals like honor and country, duty, sacrifice, democracy, all of these things. And you can see the culture germinating in the early 20th century in ways that are oriented in some real ways around these commitments, and a sort of deep, if somewhat naive, belief in America's ability to spread democracy and change the world and defeat evil. And alongside that, certain rules, conventions around conflict that are chivalrous. But what happens in the Cold War is there is no longer any sort of nugget of morality left. And a sort of new mentality has settled in that is not loyal to the country necessarily, because in the eyes of many troops, the country is nothing more than spoiled, bratty, ungrateful hippies and civilians who aren't in any way as strong or as tough or as committed to the country as they are. So that sort of cynicism breeds loyalty to the institution itself. And then at the same time, there's nothing pure, noble to look to in these conflicts. And it's largely animated by William Westmoreland's kill count strategy, which was focused just on killing communists, which was the pervading foreign policy during the Cold War. Many troops adopt that mentality, and violence becomes the sort of mission itself. And again, like when a mission that is about snuffing out a ideology like communism, if that's in some ways just a cryptic way to get around talk of genocide. That it's really what was being prescribed here was just snuffing out an ideology, which in practice meant killing as many Vietnamese people as possible. And so when that becomes the animating idea in the US military, then fragile ideas around protecting civilians and following the rules of war and having a certain respect for your enemy, those all fly out the window. And that's not to say that many American GIs felt some enduring humanity towards our enemies in the Cold War or came to feel real shame about what they had done and have worked. I know many veterans who have gone back to Vietnam, after serving in the war, for years to do activism there and try to support the people. But I think that was the moment when things shifted.
It seems like in the 90s, we had this with the first Gulf War and then with the US attack on the former Yugoslavia or on Serbia. We had this notion of humanitarian intervention, which I actually really don't believe, but it was at least some of what they were trying to put into the institution. And Hegseth is somewhat responding. Hegseth and also being like representing this bigger sort of right wing culture is like, we're going to show no quarter. We're going to do away with all those liberal ideas of some sort of humane, where we respect the Geneva Convention and respect human rights and things like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think President George H.W. Bush understood when he came into office that the military's popularity was really precarious. And the Gulf War was, in his eyes, an opportunity for a fast, quick conflict where there would be little risk to American GIs, and which had a pretty clearly evil bad guy who was doing clearly evil things. And after that conflict was so successful, relatively successful, he proclaimed that he had basically cured the country of Vietnam syndrome. And so, yes, I think you're right. There was this push in the 90s to focus on humanitarian backed projects and that were quick and short and where there were easily identifiable good and bad guys. And it's an interesting thought experience to wonder how that would play out had 9/11 not happened. But yes, I think that the sort of like visceral wound of 9/11 on the American psyche cannot be overstated. And it can be very easy, depending on your conditions and view of the world, to engage in bloodlust just reflexively after an attack like that. And Hegseth was very much one of those people. You can see his writings in the Princeton Tory in the years after 9/11 and his very fierce support of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and the neocon agenda. He really did feel, I think, he really wanted revenge, as many Americans did, and still feels to this day, I think, that he has not, and this country has not fully secured their pound of flesh. Iran was in an original member of the axis of evil. It's insane that we remain so psychically connected to 9/11 and what happened. And Hegseth is so clearly seized by those same ideas that were drilled into him as a young ROTC cadet at Princeton in the early aughts, which again makes sense. When you are young, you are deeply impressionable, and Hegseth really made his military identity so core to who he is. Classmates at Princeton told me that he would trounce around in his Army uniform, even outside of ROTC activities. It really was so important to him and to his masculinity. And he expected in the early days after 9/11, I think, that the war he was fighting in would not be Vietnam, it would be World War II. There was such an intense upswell of public support for the military, such intense fervor to defeat the bad guys. And so I just think Hegseth was rocked to his core once he realized to some degree that he was fighting a Vietnam, not a World War II. Felt very wounded. I think was unable to give up on the neocon ideas around spreading democracy that so many civilians did. And he is still motivated, I think, by 9/11 in a pretty profound way.
There's we don't have that much time left, and I have so much more that I want to bring up. You mentioned Christianity earlier, but there are also real issues of race and gender in the military. The military wasn't integrated until the late 40s, early 50s, and women didn't go to West Point until 1975, 76, right? And this is the women especially is a huge issue, right? The level of violence against women in not just the military places like Fort Hood, where I think there've been over 100 cases or something like that, but also in these schools that you write about, right? Where that's kind of part of the curriculum almost, to disrespect women, to not want them around, right? How does that play into these larger issues? And as an adjunct to that, let me throw this on top of it. Even the like that's easy to understand with Hegseth, right? This kind of opposition to women in the military. You can see they're taking people off promotion lists and things like that. But on the other side, you have the Democrats who are promoting and championing female veterans. So you have Slotkin and Spanberger and Cheryl, right? So they play to their base of women, but they're also really horrible on most issues, actually. They're not much different than Reagan Republicans would have been, right? How does that fit in, this kind of twofold almost appropriation of women in the military, either as the villain or the champion?
Yeah, I think to maybe touch on your second question first, the military requires that all who enter it subvert their identity in favor of institutional loyalty and adherence to the Pentagon Code. So you see with figures like Lloyd Austin, the first Black defense secretary, in some ways, pioneering Black officer, I think worked in the space he could to elevate other Black officers and focus on trying along the edges to disabuse the Pentagon of white power cells and all of the rest. But at the same time, is pretty muted after January 6th, for instance, and ultimately ends up basically suppressing a working group run by a fellow Black West Pointer to screen for and rid the Pentagon of violent white supremacy and other domestic extremist groups. Again, with some of these female veterans like Slotkin, there is, I think, powerful work some of them have done. Like I think of Joni Ernst, actually, a Republican who was in the Iowa National Guard, who talked about experiencing military sexual assault and pushed for reforms to improve the treatment of women. But at the end of the day, is basically lobbied behind the scenes to support Pete Hegseth as defense secretary, a virulent misogynist with credible rape accusation against him. And so again, here's this person who ultimately bows to the sort of needs of the Pentagon rather than remain loyal to her sisters in arms. The introduction of women into the military and into the service academies is, I think, really crucial to the discussion of military masculinity, because what it illustrates, among other things, is that the core conception of military masculinity, part of the promise for so long, has been that women will be deeply reliant on, but also enthralled by male strength. That is part of the deal. So if you're in the military, you are guaranteed romantic interest. You are guaranteed a partner who will defer to you and who will rely on you and who will need you to act as protector. Once that paradigm is challenged by women, many of the early West Point women were smarter than the West Point boys and they could keep up physically. That is shattering to these sort of classic masculine ideals. And so what your male West Point cadets who react very violently and through oppression and sexual violence. The other thing that's interesting too is just to see how pervasive these ideas around sort of citizenship and societal prestige are, to the point that many women feel some need to prove themselves in these military battlegrounds. Many of them, having spoken to many, they were physical. They liked a good challenge. They wanted to prove their dads wrong or whatever else. There's a million different reasons why women enter the military. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that many of the early West Point women, for instance, had older brothers. They were the only girl. And so they'd already been beaten around and had to fight for themselves. And were, I think, through those experiences, inculcated in this sort of masculine culture where they needed to prove their mettle. Many of them also had retired colonels, generals as fathers, and so felt that influence. So that's a large part of why I think women join. And again, like also in the particular political realm, it is expected that politicians are strong and unbowing and deeply committed to the country. And so I think many women who maybe have political aspirations feel like they have to serve in order to secure electoral success. So many veterans have served in political life. There's currently 100 members of Congress who've served. I think, can't remember how many presidents, but 30, I think.
31, I think is what you say in your
Yeah.
book.
There's also, just these societal expectations. If you want to reach certain positions, if you want to be considered a leader in this country, you are expected to have served.
One question, a little bit on that topic, just to pivot a little bit on we're running out of time, but we wanted to talk about your New Yorker article a little bit. There's also vets on the left. The most known example, I think, at this point is Graham Platner, who are people who were like combat vets. I actually know a lot of anti-war vets who actually were combat vets who have a lot of deep struggle, but they really politically identify with left politics, and not just like liberal politics, but left politics, right? The kind of this increasing left political space that we're seeing. And there's somewhat of a frame, particularly has come out around Platner, around redemption. And it seems, at least at this point, at least the popular narrative, not one that I agree with, is that he's maybe irredeemable with what has happened. But how much of that is, and this is what you get at with your New Yorker article, is like, how much is that a issue with who he is as an individual person versus the sort of conditioning that he went through being in the military? And just background is Platner, I think, did 4 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, 3 of which were combat. he was also private security contractor for the State Department. So he was like deep in the military. So I
Yeah.
just would like to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can get cynical about the military. And in many ways, this book is pretty depressing and dark. But one thing that always brought me hope was talking to vets of all eras or reading journals, diaries of veterans from many moons ago and tapping into who they were as children. And one question I began to ask with every interview for this book was like, what got you into the military? What inspired that? And often it would be some mix of desire for education via the GI Bill or sort of economic advancement, but also very pure ideas around American democracy and public service. The fact of the matter is that boys in particular of all stripes are prescribed the military as the answer to their problems or the sort of path to validate their dreams. This ranges from young kids in juvie or people who fail out of high school due to academic or behavioral problems to valedictorians. The ones on the lower end of the spectrum will be recruited in as privates. The valedictorians will be recruited into West Point, into these elite educational spaces. And so I think that so many youthful desires that could be channeled in really pure ways end up just going to feed the Pentagon, and I think that's a tragedy. And I also just, having spoken to so many vets now, understand, I think, in a real way, how pure and innocent most people are when they enter the military. Okay, maybe you're 19 or 20, maybe you're 18, and you can sign up at 17 with your parents' permission. The fact of the matter is, even if you sign up at 23, these are children that are entering this system. These are children. The military relies on the sort of malleability, the innocence of children, and it cynically exploits those traits to sell a bill of goods and get them into their system. And when I started to hear the allegations against Graham Platner and see some really ugly things online about him, that he was born bad, that he was born a killer, that he was irredeemable, all of these things, it just struck me as so divorced from the reality that I knew, having spoken to all of these veterans. And even 3.5 months ago, before everything really exploded, I just was like, I want to talk to Graham's mom and try to figure out what he was like as a kid. Because my sense is he probably had a naive, somewhat pure obsession with the military, and that's what propelled him. And indeed, that is exactly it. He loved military history. He enjoyed the feeling of being physical, moving his body, being in a group, in a community. These are things that we should all support and validate. In Graham's case, he glommed onto the military at an early age because, again, there weren't that many other options. There aren't that many other options. And he entered at 19. And I just refuse to believe that Graham Platner was any of these things at 19. And so my efforts via this New Yorker piece were to show what he was like as a child, what he was like at 19, and then what he experienced through really intense combat deployments and how that changes people.
Building off that, like Scott, I've been around anti-war vets my whole life. I started doing what I do by talking to people who are in BBAW, and every day I have an exchange with a couple anti-war vets. Shout out to Trey and James. And I ask them this all the time. It's like, most of the vets I know, and I know it's a small sample, but hate Trump and they hate what he's doing. The guy's cut VA benefits. He's made it more difficult to get certain treatments. He's pissed off the VFW, which is hard to do, right? Yet there is still this really strong support for him, institution and MAGA institutionally, from soldiers and vets, right? And now a lot of these people are in ICE and they're cops and they're sheriffs and everything else. Is it because of this kind of masculinity that they remain loyal to him, even though they're really not getting a whole lot out of it anymore? You're not getting the benefits or the prestige you once had, as you pointed out earlier. Why is there still this support and attachment to Trump and what he's doing among soldiers and among veterans when they're not really getting anything materially out of it like they used to?
Yeah, I think it's probably two forces pretty straightforwardly. One is that, yes, I think that especially in his reelection campaign, Trump very explicitly called back to an era of patriarchy in which men were secure in their status, guaranteed a good job, had benefits. It was suffused in this nostalgia for another world that many men no longer enjoy. And some of those, some of the resentments around that are based in misogyny and racism. But then there are also legitimate frustrations they have around the shifting economy and educational environment and all of the rest. And so it's very intoxicating to think back to that world and hope that Trump can revive it. And again, and yes, related to that is the idea of strength. And when the world is on fire and it feels like there are all of these massive societal forces that you have no bearing on, you have no ability to control, it can be very easy to look at yourself and strengthen yourself and harden yourself because that's something you have control over. Just like this base instinct of, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be strong. I'm going to kick ass. I'm going to show through my appearance and my outlook that I have not been bent, bowed, weakened by all of these forces. There's something very primal there. The other fact, of course, the typical story is that Democrats have just done a terrible job recruiting and activating veterans. They recruit veteran candidates, mostly people unlike Graham Platner, who have Ivy League degrees and served as officers and feel kind of phony to many veterans or typify the out of touch officers that they resented because they were constantly having to follow orders and being scolded for minor infractions and all of the rest. It's an elite sense of the military that the Democrats support because partly they're just afraid to look the brutality in the face, I think. But then just practically looking in 2016, I did a big story in the New York Times Magazine. Trump won historic margins with veterans in that election. And the point that a Brown political science professor, Doug Kreiner, argued in a data analysis that it was crucial to his victory in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, I believe, in communities that had the highest combat casualty rates in Iraq and Afghanistan. Trump's popularity surged in that first campaign for a Republican, very anti-war, even for a Democrat, like very anti-war, very critical about Bush's lies, all of the rest. So that was huge.
Running against someone who voted for the war also.
Yes, yes, exactly. Exactly. So that's crucial and a total misstep by the party. And then at the same time, the RNC invested millions and millions of dollars to go out to air shows and county fairgrounds and build a list of veterans and activate them. They just had a get out the vote movement. Millions and millions of dollars. The DNC had nothing, zero, zilch, not a single. They had one part-time staffer, but there was just no investment in veterans as a voting bloc. And so, under those conditions, many veterans will gravitate towards the party that says they care about them.
In 2020, and maybe even in 2016, Bernie Sanders got more donations from active duty and vets than anybody else did. And this is something, I'm glad you brought that up, because in 2016, because everybody I know, the liberals I know, it was racism. There's more to it than that. Trump's racist, and I point out, Trump was against these wars in 2016. This guy condemned it. I hate saying this. He's condemned the Vietnam War stronger than any other national politician I've heard, except for John Kerry, who was when he ran in 2004 because of what he'd done earlier, even in fact. And I think that's really, they're missing out there because there are a lot of these veterans who don't have the same impression. As you point out at one point, people will say, thank you for your, I think it was in the Platner article, right? Or somebody said that, he was defending Platner. You can't say thank you for your service and then beat the hell out of this guy for actually serving and having to endure everything he did in that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing to give Republican voters some credit, I think, again, going back to this recruitment gambit I laid out post Vietnam, the communities that are seeing the war up close, that are feeling the damage, are often rural conservative communities. And these communities are absorbing that. They're often extending grace to their neighbors and relatives who are struggling. There is real work that is happening in these places that I think liberal communities, elite liberal communities, just don't do anymore, don't know how to do. They're just so out of touch. They're not connected to veterans coming home and really struggling. And so the rhetoric that they're employing feels disingenuous and feels disconnected from what's actually happening. And yeah, conservatives are able to tap into that emotionality. Voters, again, they really extend grace and forgiveness, I think. And politicians know how to seize that, know how to play on those emotional feelings better than the Democrats do.
Since Vietnam, the biggest casualty rates have always come from southern states with poor whites, which again, the Democrats would never acknowledge. They can't reckon with that.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
it's interesting to note on Grant Platner is that you make I didn't actually know this, but you make a point about how Maine has per capita more vets than any other state. And then two, just from and I don't think this isn't a very good sample, but a lot of the online stuff we see is from liberal elites going after Platner in a major way. We've posted stuff on our Twitter in support of Platner, and I get all kinds of trolling from liberal elites who he's a rapist with a Nazi tattoo, that sort of thing. But it's interesting that the voters in Maine were like pretty down Platner until this last story came.
Yeah, absolutely. And
The near Tandons of the world are so just to get a dig in there.
oh yeah, no,
Shannon Watts, Neera Tanden. Yeah.
yikes. I haven't
Yeah.
heard that name in a while, but now it's gonna haunt my feelings. No, you're totally right. And I think Platner told me even after he dropped out, I think I could have salvaged this. I think that it's all very difficult. And I think that this latest allegation, I think there was a way for him to handle it differently. And it's really tricky. But anyways, to set that aside, I do think that in general, voters, because he was up close with them, because they knew people like him in their communities, he was there in a real way that sort of wasn't just reductive profiles in the New York Times or whatever. And so I think in a way, I believe in his transformation. I think it's not fully complete yet. I think he still needs to do work probably, and it seems to have come in fits and starts. But I believe in that. Again, that's only based on a few hours of conversation with him and his friends and just my own hopes for this world and what can be salvaged after conflict. But I think all of these other people in Maine saw him repeatedly, were up close with him, and really did believe in it in a deep way and saw it in a deep way. And it's an impossible question, but I think there was probably a path for him to win despite all of this if he had acted with humility and moved forward in a way that was honest as he had been doing. And because I do think that Maine was willing to forgive him.
We're a little bit over the time. I don't know if Bob has any other questions.
Oh, I've got a lot more, but maybe we'll have you on again sometime. There's so much more to talk about on this topic, but no, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, folks, we've been talking with Jasper Craven, who's author of God Forgives, Brothers Don't. Where can folks find the book? That's usually our last question.
Yes, I would advise them to go into their local indie if they can, ask for God Forgives, Brothers Don't. And if it's not on the shelves, they can pre-order it or order it to the bookstore, I should say.
Is it already published? Is it actually published now?
Yeah, it is. Yep.
Folks, if you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Jasper, it's been great talking with you. Really enjoyed this topic. Everyone else out there, make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.